Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Scott Goetz. I'm a professor at Northern Arizona University, and I'm a remote sensing scientist, ecologist, and really happy to have today a great lineup of speakers. We did have some changes, so we'll have, I think, 4 instead of 5 today, but it should be a really good session. And I'm co-chairing this with Chris Hakkenberg, and maybe Chris can introduce himself.
Hey everyone, thanks for coming out today for this session. I'm really excited. I am also at Northern Arizona University, an assistant research professor, working with Scott and others using remote sensing, specifically LiDAR, to look at forest structure and biodiversity and productivity and wildfire and lots of good stuff like that. So I think we've got some great topics today across multiple biomes. So I'm really excited for it. So thanks for joining us.
Great, thanks, Chris. So I'm happy to introduce Jed Brodie. Today is our first speaker. Jed's a professor at the University of Montana. I'm having a difficult time finding my briefing sheet of bios. I'm sorry about that. I had it here a second ago. Jed, maybe instead of us wasting time, you could say a little bit, introduce yourself and say a little bit about yourself, if you don't mind.
Sure. Yeah, no problem. So my name is Jed Brodie. Yes, as Scott mentioned, I'm a professor in the Craighead Chair of Conservation at the University of Montana. I'm also affiliated with the University of Malaysia Sarawak, and I've worked all over the world, but with a primary focus on tropical Southeast Asia for the last 20, 25 years. And that's a brief intro. Should I dive right into the talk, Scott?
Yes, dive in. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Scott and Chris, for inviting me to this, and thank you all for attending. It's super fun to be able to give a talk like this. So I'm going to be talking about linking remote sensing and field data to enhance conservation. And it will be focused on some of my work in Southeast Asia over the last couple of decades. So as presumably you all know, we are in the middle of a global extinction crisis. And this is driven by a lot of different factors, but all stemming from various human activities. So it's not, though, we tend to hear in the public media that this is just species going extinct. And that is true, but it's more than that, actually. So every species interacts with others in its environment and affects biogeochemical cycles, affects the ecosystem in which it lives. So we're losing those functional roles that species play. Some work I did a few years ago showed that herbivores and frugivores, or fruit-eating animals, are disproportionately impacted among species suffering extinction. So what that means is the extinction crisis is not just removing species, but it's removing species that are affecting plants through grazing on them or dispersing their seeds. The extinction crisis is also disproportionately affecting evolutionarily unique species in certain areas in particular. So I bring this up to say that when we talk about conservation and extinction and persistence, we have to think not just about numbers of species or who those species are, but we have to measure functional richness, functional diversity, and phylogenetic diversity, or evolutionary diversity. And I'll come back to this later in the talk with these measurements. Okay, so this is from that same analysis where I broke it down. My colleagues and I broke the drivers of biodiversity loss down by particular human activities. And we looked at a bunch, but what you can see here in terms of the top graph is change in functional richness, and the bottom graph, the change in phylogenetic or evolutionary diversity. And really, out of all the factors driving these changes, it's really two big ones. It's habitat loss and it's hunting or overexploitation. So these are the two that I'm going to focus on today, and the two that I've focused a lot of my work on. I do want to make a quick point that climate change, which shows up here as having fairly negligible impacts, is, I think, underrated for a couple of reasons that I'm happy to talk about if there are questions later, but I'm not going to be focusing on it too much for this talk. Okay, so in order to address conservation and the extinction crisis, humanity, the United Nations, we, all of us, agreed very recently, just this last December, to a goal called the 30 by 30 goal, which is to protect the commitments of many countries to protect 30% of their land and sea areas by the year 2030 through well-connected systems of protected areas. Now, I would argue that this is certainly one of, possibly the most ambitious conservation target humans have ever set for biodiversity. So it's pretty cool. And it has two, excuse me, it has two key points that I'm going to be talking about today. The first is this area target, 30%. And the second is that they have to be well connected, right? And both of these are very important and sometimes quite difficult to achieve. All right, so what I'm going to be talking about for the rest of this talk is preventing habitat loss through well-connected protected areas. My work focuses in Borneo, which is right here in Southeast Asia. This is the third largest island in the world. It's exactly straddling the equator in the Indo-Malay archipelago between Australia and mainland Asia. This is what some of the forests of Borneo look like or used to look like. These are the tallest angiosperm forests in the world, incredibly diverse and just a really, really fun place to work, but also a really globally important place for biodiversity. So starting in 2010, I mounted a big camera trapping campaign across as much of Malaysian Borneo as we could get to. And this was just an incredibly fun project. It allowed me to work with indigenous groups in several different areas who were really into it and had just obviously an incredible amount of knowledge on the ecosystems and species that we were looking at. I also did a lot of this work with my family, often in quite rugged conditions. I'm training early career field technicians right here. That's what we're working on. So through that camera trapping, we get literally hundreds of thousands of photographs that look like this, just documenting the animals of the rainforest, where they live, what they're doing, when they're active, all sorts of things. So just a couple of introductions. This up here on the left is the Sunda clouded leopard, the apex predator of Borneo, the bearded pig, one of the most important herbivore granivores, with a variety of primates, including this is an orangutan. So it's a very rich vertebrate community. Now, Borneo had very recently, I mean, 1950 maybe sound a long time ago to some of the very young people in the audience, but it's really not that long ago, right? And in 1950, Borneo had almost as much forest cover as it did 5,000 years ago. In the intervening 70 odd years, we've reduced it by about half, which is actually still pretty good for much of Southeast Asia. And of course, much of that has been driven by the need to expand this particularly lucrative agricultural crop, which is oil palm. So monocultural oil palm plantations have replaced a lot of native forest across the region, but particularly in places like Borneo. So now, Borneo, though, does have a good system of protected areas. Now, this map is showing some of the international divisions. This line here is the border between the Malaysian part of Borneo, which is about a third of the island, and the Indonesian side, which is about these 2/3. The green blobs here are the protected areas, and you can see that's actually decent protected area coverage, especially for a tropical country. But the problem is that for big, wide-ranging, and therefore low population density animals like clouded leopards and orangutans and many other things, even a big protected area here is not big enough on its own to support these species for the long term. So the goal, of course, then, is to not let these protected areas become on their own, but rather to either keep them connected to each other or reestablish connections to each other via habitat corridors. So these could be strips of forest that animals and plants can move along to get from one park to another. So this is all, everything I'm talking about here is part of the context of developing a statewide connectivity plan for the state of Sarawak, Malaysia, which runs from about here all the way down here. And the problem, though, is you look at this map and the number of possible connections among those protected areas is pretty high. It's too high for us to protect all of them. So we have to prioritize. We have to ask which of all those possible connections are the most important habitat corridors. And so that's what my research is focused on for this particular issue, for this connectivity plan. So the way we do that, to start off, is, as I said, the title of the talk, linking remote sensing and field data. So what we're doing here, and this is very common, is to take our muddy boots, difficult to collect field data, in this case camera traps, and combine them with the power of broad scale, high resolution, high coverage satellite or other remote sensing data. And this is one example, this model down here, of how we can do this. Now we use a lot of what are called hierarchical occupancy or local abundance models. But the basic point is just that we're using a statistical model to link the species occurrence, which is from our field data, to the habitat characteristics, which usually comes from remote sensing data. That's the point there. Now, this is super common, as I mentioned. There are some distinct problems with this approach that I'm going to talk about later in the presentation. But for now, we can use this linkage to create estimates of habitat selection. So we combine our field and our remote sensing to estimate habitat selection of every different species in the community for which we have enough data. All right, then we apply those estimates to movement models to generate paths of where we predict movement to occur and how much movement we predict to occur. So in this particular case, we use what are called circuit theoretic models. They're derived from electrical circuit theory. Things like CircuitScape or GFlow or OmniFlow are some programs that use this approach. But there are plenty of other strategies for movement models you could use. The point is just to take a habitat selection data and then based on that, figure out where animals are going to go. So in this case, this gray blob is one protected area, this other gray blob is another one. Where on the landscape are they going to move as they go from one protected area to another, and how many of them are going to get through? So that's how we estimate connectivity. But we don't stop there, and I think this is really key. Connectivity, there is a huge literature on ecological connectivity. But connectivity is not the end in and of itself. Connectivity is a means to an end. And the end goal, the ultimate goal, is species persistence, is not having them go extinct. So we put the connectivity and the habitat selection and some population data together into metapopulation models. And together then ask, how might different corridors affect the long-term persistence of all the species in the region, in the state? All right, so again, we're trying to quantify we're trying to figure out which are the most important habitat corridors. And we define importance for a given corridor as the contribution of that corridor to the long-term persistence of all the species for which we can measure. So we're not focusing on a single umbrella species, we're looking at everything that we can. So this is a map of possible corridors across Sarawak. So now, I apologize, I keep changing colors, but now the black blobs are the protected areas, and the colored strips here are possible corridors linking them. And then this graph here is a histogram just of corridor importance values. But I want to point out that it's on a log scale. The y-axis is on a log scale here. So what this is showing is that these two red corridors here, the corridors 1 and 2, are multiple orders of magnitude more important than every other possible corridor on the island of Borneo. So that's these two right here. And then these other 3 in pink here are themselves much more important than all the other hundreds or thousands of possible corridors on the island of Borneo. So this is really useful because now we can go to policymakers and say, okay, you don't have to try to conserve every single corridor out there. You only have to focus on really these 2, but hopefully these top 5. And that's what we've done. But before I go into that application, I just want to say, well, you may be wondering, what is it about those 5 corridors that makes them so important? It's basically 2 things. It is, so this is a graph of all the possible corridors showing the length of the corridor and then its importance, divided between corridors that connect big patches versus corridors that connect small patches. So this is just showing 2 things. Short corridors or short linkages are the most important, particularly if they connect large habitat patches. So that's it. That's just as a general rule of thumb, you want to home in on the shortest corridors that are protecting big patches. All right, so what we've done then is take all this information and in a kind of parallel process. So at the same time we're collecting field data, we're also establishing connections with government agencies and NGOs and timber industry and indigenous groups, as many stakeholders as we could. And I say we, this is all through partnership with a bunch of people, but particularly my friends Muhammad Aslan, who's a professor at University of Malaysia, Sarawak, and Jason Hahn, who's currently the director of the World Wildlife Fund for Sarawak. And of course, they, being local Sarawakians, are able to help translate this impact in a way that I never could. So we came up with a Sarawak Wildlife Corridor plan, which we presented to all these stakeholders. And we've currently been pretty successful at achieving protection for, I think we're up to 3 or 4 of those top 5 most important corridors. Okay, so I'm going to switch gears slightly now and talk about the protected areas themselves. So back to this United Nations 30 by 30 goal. This is, as I said, a super ambitious, hopefully very effective strategy, but we have to ask, is it going to work? In other words, are protected areas actually effective at doing what we think they're going to do, which is conserving biodiversity? And there's some reasons to think that they might not be. So this is a big project that we are kind of just wrapped up the first stage of, with again a bunch of collaborators contributing data. I want to particularly highlight Scott, Chris, Pat Burns, all at Northern Arizona University, and then also James Ball at Cambridge, who've really been the drivers of the Jedediah component of this work. Okay, so the question is, how well do protected areas work? And worldwide, most parks, the majority of parks, are vastly overfunded, have poor management and enforcement. So this is a photo of the inside of a national park in Sumatra, showing very recent wholesale deforestation inside the park. Okay, so even when that doesn't happen, even when the habitat stays intact, the trees aren't cut, there can still be massive defaunation driven by things like overhunting. Okay, so this is where the hunting now and the habitat loss kind of start to interact synergistically. So there are reports of this from all over the world, overexploitation, overhunting inside parks or otherwise intact forests. All right, so that's looking at the efficacy of parks inside the park boundaries. But we also want to look at protected area impacts on biodiversity outside the reserve boundaries. And there are a couple reasons for this. So on the one hand, you could have a park, like say back in the background here, these trees are inside a national park, but then right at the border of the park, logging companies weren't able to take trees out of the park, so instead they just displaced their activities and completely destroy all the habitat outside the park. So that happens all over the place, and that's a pattern we call leakage, protected area leakage. In contrast, you could have a positive spillover effect of parks, and this is something we often see in marine protected areas, where you establish a no-take zone for a marine protected area. The populations of fish and squid and whatnot build up in the MPA, and then they get high enough that they spill out and both provide livelihood for subsistence fisher people in the surrounding areas, and also just increase the biodiversity and the abundance and the diversity of organisms in those surrounding areas. So the question we have to ask then is whether leakage or spillover is the dominant pattern, particularly in tropical terrestrial parks, where we haven't assessed these patterns at all. All right, so obviously, these are super important issues for conservation. So they've been addressed many times. The recurring problem in the assessments is, as Joppa and Baff put it in a really great paper, protected area networks are biased towards places that are unlikely to face land conversion and also hunting pressures, even in the absence of protection. So in other words, what this picture is showing, some beautiful far off mountain lake, we tend to put our national parks in high elevation areas that are way out of the way. So they're beautiful, but even if we hadn't made it a national park, they're unlikely to have suffered logging or hunting much anyway. They're just remote and inaccessible. So what we would say about this statistically is that assessing the efficacy of protection is statistically confounded with two things: forest quality and accessibility. So the way to get around this is to deconfound both of those factors with good measurements of them. So first, I'll talk about deconfounding forest quality. And this, again, just relies on getting really good measurements of the structural quality of the forest, and therefore its habitat quality, the habitat quality that it provides to the animal species we're looking at. So this is where the Jedediah data come in, and this is just an incredible way to map habitat quality. This particular map is one you probably haven't seen it. I don't think this has been published, but this is a map of plant area index across the island of Borneo at a super fine scale, running from 0 to 6. And what that means is that in the highest area, in the darkest green areas, there are 6 layers of leaves between the ground and the sky. So if you zoomed in on just some random pixel, you'd get a 3-dimensional image of the whole forest from the bottom up to the top, which is just incredible. And I find this also really interesting because just from the literature, it seems that a leaf area index of about 6 is consistent and conserved across angiosperm forests around the world, which I find really interesting. It has to do with just how much light percolates through, and after that 6th layer of leaves, there isn't enough light getting through to support a 7th in general. Okay, so this is how we account for forest quality. Then to account for accessibility, we actually use those same circuit theory-based approaches that I talked about earlier for looking at animal movement, but here for looking at the movement of humans. So we start with the location of population centers, and then the location of roads and navigable rivers. So we're looking at how humans will disperse out from the population centers out across the landscape. We look at elevational change, so it's more difficult to go up a steep slope than over flat ground. We look at land cover, so it's more difficult to move through dense undergrowth than through open conditions, etc. We put all this together and we run our circuit theory models across it, and we can get maps of landscape accessibility, how easy it is for humans to access every single point on the landscape. This is work that my former student Maren Deeth had pioneered. Okay, so now we've talked about deconfounding these two critical factors, and we can put them together. But first, I want to say we validated this accessibility map with actual photos of human hunters moving out on the landscape. So we have thousands of camera traps out. These are to detect pictures of non-human animals in general, but we also got plenty of pictures of humans. So this is a guy out hunting with a shotgun, and this guy is going a little more old school. He's got a blowpipe with a spear tip at the end, and then a quiver full of poison darts. But we can look at the prevalence of human hunters as a function of our estimated accessibility, and it maps out really well. Okay, so putting it all together, now expanding the scope of the analysis from Borneo, which I've been talking about before, to all of Southeast Asia up to southern China. Okay, so I collected collated camera trap data from a bunch of great colleagues working across the region, 1,600 camera trap sites. We also looked at birds via community science data using eBird. Then this is our map of site accessibility for the region. You can see some interesting, you can actually see the higher accessibility road networks in Borneo here and Sumatra. See that in general, mainland Asia has much higher accessibility than Sumatra, which in turn is more accessible than Borneo. These are our protected areas. So we're evaluating now mammal and bird diversity inside versus outside protected areas. And this is what we found. So this recently came out in Nature. This is the effects of protected areas on, in this case, bird diversity. So looking, as I said, at species richness, but also functional richness, so the diversity of ecological functions played by these birds, and phylogenetic diversity, the diversity of evolutionary lineages in the birds. And in all cases, protected areas have significantly higher diversity than unprotected areas. So what this means is that, yes, protected areas, and they have better forest. But even aside from that, there's something about being a protected area that conserves all facets of bird diversity. And what we think that is probably protection from hunting. Okay, and then for mammals, the patterns were a little bit different. For mammals, we found a strong effect of diversity, the effects of protected areas on diversity outside the reserves themselves. So this is comparing, again, species richness, functional richness, and phylogenetic diversity in areas close to a small protected area with areas close to a large protected area. And diversity is higher across the board near large protected areas. So what this shows is that large protected areas have elevated mammal diversity in the surrounding landscape, which is consistent with spillover rather than leakage, at least as generated by large protected areas. Okay, so I want to talk briefly about an implication of this for what are called the essential biodiversity variables. Essentially, the EBVs, this is a recent initiative to find standardized ways of monitoring diversity over large scales. For species, the main EBV is species occurrence. And the idea is we take, as I talked about before, we take species occurrence data, maybe from camera traps or whatever else, plus environmental data from remote sensing, usually, species attributes, and then we do species occurrence predictions. The problem is that this ignores hunting. It ignores this pattern of empty forests whereby you get structurally intact forests where all the animals have actually been hunted out. And you can't see that from space, from the remote sensing data. So, but this is a widespread phenomenon where forests, again, structurally intact, but they've lost their large and medium size, in some cases even smaller animals. Okay, so I want to propose a slight modification of this approach where we still have our species occurrence data, but we separate human occurrence from other species. We use the human occurrence in combination with environmental data to map accessibility, hunting pressure, illegal logging pressure, whatever else. We then use that as a covariate along with environmental covariates in our estimates of the occurrence of the other non-human species. So it's a slight modification, but I think this middle step here is really important for getting unbiased occurrence estimates for a huge number of species. Okay, now I want to wrap up with putting all this together and talking about how we use all these data to actually designate new tropical protected areas. This is, again, this is a large project, large and very collaborative project. The analyses I'm going to talk about were headed by my former postdoc, Sarah Williams, who did just an incredible job. The problem statement is we're working with the state of Sabah in Malaysia. Prior to the study, about 25% of the state was in protected areas, but the state of their own accord decided they wanted to bump that up to 30% coverage. So that entailed adding around 350,000 hectares, or around close to 5 Singapores, right? That's a fairly substantial bit of new protected areas. But they didn't specify, the government didn't specify if they wanted that to be one big new park, several smaller parks, corridors linking the existing parks, or what. So they left it up to biodiversity scientists to find the optimal solution there. The typical approach would have been to use something like MarcSand, which is a super powerful optimization program. MarcSand, according to their own website, is the most widely used decision support software for conservation planning, used in 184 countries, which is the vast majority of nations on Earth. The problem, though, is that it only accounts for area. It doesn't directly account for connectivity, which, as I've shown and argued, is really important. So we did a hybrid strategy. We wanted to prioritize new conservation areas based on both area and connectivity. So now we're looking at these red blobs for the existing parks in Sabah. And these blue areas, these are, again, the circuit theory generated estimates of where animals are going to move across the landscape. So we took data on our species occurrences for plants, vertebrates, invertebrates. We looked at connectivity in 2 ways, both up mountains, elevational connectivity to allow for climate change resilience, corridors linking parks, and then also above ground carbon to help Malaysia meet its international mitigation objectives. And so then we prioritized a final set of areas that maximize the representation of all of these things. But so far, this is fairly standard, again, except for the inclusion of connectivity. So here we wanted to ask, are there any costs or trade-offs to conserving connectivity? And it turns out that there aren't. With connectivity, you get just about the same coverage of these different conservation features as you do without connectivity. So at least in this particular system, we can have our cake and eat it too. All right, so this is then the map of Sabah showing existing protected areas, our proposed new protected areas, all of which are really important for biodiversity in their own right, but also provide important connectivity across the landscape. And I particularly want to highlight this area down here, which is an area called the Ulu Padas that I've done quite a bit of work in collaboration with friends in the village of Longpasia, particularly Pangeran Salutam. So this is an indigenous village, amazing place to work, amazing community, and incredible ecosystems around there, including a huge variety of wildlife and ridiculously cute primates, giant trees, all sorts of things. So let me know if anyone's interested in visiting. I can set you up with cool people to talk to. All right, on that note, I, of course, have tons of people to thank that I won't list by name, but particularly the various students, postdocs, collaborators I've worked with, my wife and 2 kids with whom I do a lot of field work, and I am more than happy to take any questions. Thank you again for attending and of course, for inviting me.
Thank you, Jed. That was fantastic. I mean, we've worked together a bit, and I learned a lot myself. So really nice. We do have a couple of questions, actually, from one of the other speakers, Marc, in the discussion forum, and I encourage others to enter questions. And I'll maybe take the first 2, and then I think maybe you answered the third. But it's do edge effects matter? And how wide do corridors need to be?
Yeah, it's a great question. Edge effects certainly matter. We don't have a good sense. I mean, we've known that, we as ecologists have known for a long time that they matter, but the distances to which they permeate into intact habitat vary so much depending on the species you're looking at or the type of edge effect and the configuration of the patch. I think the question is focusing on how, given edge effects, how wide do we need to make corridors, which is a great question, and we don't have a good answer for it. We, in our approach in Sarawak, we just took a kind of simple back of the envelope approach and said we want to make them on average twice the width of the territory size of a clouded leopard, which is the biggest predator and probably therefore has the biggest territory sizes. We just didn't want a single clouded leopard big male plugging up the corridor and not letting others get through. So that was the very ad hoc approach we took. I think there are more sophisticated techniques we could use now, especially that we have more data, but we haven't done that yet.
And then the third part of Marc's questions was the extent to which these corridors are species dependent. I think maybe you partly answered that by saying you're incorporating all species that you have in your camera traps, right?
Yeah, that's a good question. So as Scott said, we tried to not make them species dependent by summing the importance across all species for which we could get data. We did also a separate analysis where we looked at different groups. So we asked, okay, if you were to make a corridor based just on carnivores, how well would that work for, or if you were to make it for a single carnivore, how well would that work for other carnivores or herbivores or frugivores? Turns out that within guilds, the umbrella species approach for corridors works pretty well. A corridor for one carnivore tends to work reasonably well for other carnivores, less well for herbivores. So hence, I think the need to prioritize across as many taxa as possible.
Great, thank you. I actually have a question related, I think. So it's really nice to see you take this all the way to the policy new park implementation and optimization and all the things you have to consider there. And I guess there are, maybe you addressed this somewhat already, but there are some trade-offs, right, between the corridors versus large new protected areas. And to what extent do corridors in some ways make some of the animals that you're studying more vulnerable to hunting, and that they're, maybe perhaps more accessible?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think there are two big things missing from corridor world currently. One is the effects of hunting. How does hunting reduce connectivity? You could have a perfectly good corridor, but if it's totally overhunted, it's not only not providing connectivity, but it's potentially even bad, right? It's an ecological sink for these species. I have a PhD student working on that right now in Borneo, trying to get at that. I think the other thing that hasn't been well incorporated is restoration, right? We tend to try to, when we prioritize areas for connectivity or new protected areas, we focus on where is there existing forest rather than where could we restore that would potentially be really good. So I think bringing those two things into the connectivity world is really key right now. In terms of the hunting, the approach we've taken is basically to find the best places for corridors and parks, and then kind of assume that the designation of those areas for protection is the first step, and the effective management to control hunting is the second step. So we don't go there. We haven't gone there. So, but clearly that is going to be really critical for the effective management of these areas.
Great, thank you, Jed. We do have another question. I think maybe we could take this other question, given we have 4 speakers instead of the initial planned 5. So, and the question is from Rajeev Gupta, and he asks, how is Jedediah data useful for species hunting modeling?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know for sure yet. I think that is one of the follow-ups that we're all working on after this initial paper. So habitat information is incredibly useful for hunting modeling. I think Jedediah data is just such a good way to characterize habitat that it's probably going to be very useful for hunting. So in particular, what I'm really excited about with the Jedediah data is being able to model forest habitat differently for arboreal species versus ground dwelling species. Up until now, if you just use forest cover, you can't really partition that. But with Jedediah data, we can say, well, actually, it's this component of the forest structure that's really important for arboreal species and their susceptibility to hunting versus the understory component, for example, that might be more important for terrestrial species and their susceptibility to hunting. So short answer, we don't quite know yet, but I'm excited to find out.
Fantastic. Thanks again, Jed. Just real quick, I would point out the Jedediah is a LiDAR instrument on the International Space Station that shoots laser beams at the forest, and that's how you get that cool three-dimensional structure that Jed was talking about.
Absolutely. And if anybody's listening from NASA, we need to make that permanent. We need that to be, we need global LiDAR data permanently every day for the foreseeable future. Okay. Thanks again, Scott and Chris. I appreciate it.
Glad you could do this. Okay, Chris, I'm going to pass it off to you to introduce the next speaker.
Thank you, Jed. That was great. Yeah, we need more space lasers. I think we can all agree on that. And thanks for the questions. I would remind folks, if they can, to try to put the questions in the live Q&A tab versus the discussion tab. But you know what? At the end of the day, we'll all good. So great. Yeah, I would like to introduce Rajeev Pillay, who's a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Northern British Columbia. He got his PhD in wildlife ecology and conservation from the University of Florida in Gainesville, 2016. And he is interested in biodiversity conservation issues in the tropics, in a region where biodiversity is the richest in the world, but overwhelming industrial scale human pressures are affecting that. His current research leverages Earth observations on tropical rainforest integrity, coupled with global biodiversity data sets to investigate the role of structurally intact and minimally disturbed native forests in mitigating the biodiversity crisis. So with that, I will hand it over to Rajeev.
Thanks, Chris. Just want to check in first. Can you see my screen and my PowerPoint? All right. Yeah. Thank you very much, Chris and Scott, for inviting me to talk here. And thank you all for attending. I'm really happy to talk to you today about my ongoing postdoctoral work on intact tropical rainforests and their role in conserving biodiversity. So for the last few years, the focus of my work has largely centered around tropical forest degradation and its impacts on biodiversity. Since my PhD, I have been able to work with remotely sensed data on forest integrity and kind of flip the question around. So from degradation, which is like intact forests and biodiversity and their role for biodiversity. So before I get into that, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge my mentors, Oscar Venter and James Watson, and my main collaborators, as well as NASA, for funding this work and supporting us for the last several years. So here's the thrust of the problem. Most analyses of land use change and land cover change in tropical forest ecosystems focus on deforestation, which is the clear cutting of forests and the conversion of forests to agriculture. So halting deforestation is usually the focus of forest conservation efforts. However, there are several other anthropogenic pressures that can cause forest degradation. Now, forest degradation is actually change in forest conditions. So unlike deforestation, there is no land use change. The forest remains forests. However, its properties, for example, like structural condition might change, its function such as species composition, and things like services, for example, carbon storage might change. So forest degradation is rapidly increasing worldwide, and it's an insidious threat to tropical forests worldwide. Now, if anyone has ever been to a tropical forest or worked in tropical forests, they would know that tropical forests would have a multi-storage structure, as you can see in this picture here. So there is usually an emergent layer, which can be as tall as 60 to 80 meters high, poking up above the main canopy. There is a closed canopy, which is 75% of canopy cover or more. There is a mid-story, there's an understory, and there's a ground layer. So an aerial view of an intact tropical rainforest would look something like this, whereas disturbance such as logging would make it look like this. So in this picture, you can see how the canopy opens up, and it also shows you how forest cover, the concept of forest cover, is quite a binary concept. So both of these images would be classified as forest cover, but the picture on the left is actually an intact high quality forest, whereas the picture on the right is a highly degraded forest. So my questions, my broad interest in this area is largely centered on the question of how is altered tropical rainforest quality from degradation likely to affect biodiversity. Now, one of the challenges of measuring forest quality, especially at biome-wide scales or at global scales, is that it's quite, until recently, it's been quite challenging to obtain forest quality data from remote sensing. So the map here shows forest cover from Global Forest Watch, where the green is all forest cover. So it's impossible to distinguish which is degraded, which is high quality. So it's a binary forest, non-forest layer. And as a result, for a long time, researchers have relied on field studies where they go to primary forest site and a degraded forest site, such as a log forest, and collect biodiversity data and analyze that data. Often these data are aggregated at global scale using meta-analyses, or if you're lucky enough to have a large data set, typically in one geographic region, such as important papers by Luke Gibson in 2011 in Nature, which was a meta-analysis, and another paper by Josh Barlow in 2016 in Nature, which was a data set of around 2,000 or more species of plants, birds, and dung beetles from one state in Brazil. Now, in 2019, Andrew Hansen at Montana State University came up with, or tried to come up with, a measure of forest quality that goes beyond forest cover and tries to get at a forest quality gradient globally. So he used canopy cover, the time since disturbance, and canopy height, all derived from Landsat and spacebound LiDAR, and came up with a metric called index, or the SCI. The structural condition index is a continuous index that ranges from 1 to 18, where the lowest value of 1 represents forests that are highly degraded. So these are less than 5 meters tall. They've been disturbed quite recently, and they have less than 25% canopy cover. Often they are so badly degraded that they classified as non-forest. Whereas the highest values of 14 to 18, the really dark greens, they are close to primary forest or primary forest. They are more than 15 meters tall. They've been undisturbed for quite a long time, and they have greater than 70. So these data sets were published in Scientific Data and Nature, Ecology and Evolution. However, the structural condition index just gets at structure. As Jed Brodie recently just said, structure alone may not tell you what kind of disturbances are there. So intact forests, for example, structurally intact forests could still have hunting. So to try to get at some of these human pressures, Andy Hansen came up with another metric called the structural integrity index, where he combined the structural condition index with the human footprint, which is a cumulative map of 8 human pressures. This data set ranges from 0 to 50, where 0 is basically wilderness and 50 is extremely high human pressures, the areas in reds. And together, when they are aggregated together, these two data sets provide a measure called the FSI, which ranges from the highest value, the darkest greens here, are not only intact in structure, but have a human footprint of less than equal to 4. Now, this value of the human footprint of less than equal to 4 is important because prior work has demonstrated that beyond this human footprint value, things like species rate. So this is kind of so these forests at high SCI, high FSI are not only structurally intact, but they are extremely low in human pressures. Using these two data sets, Andy Hansen, he found half of the tropical rainforests worldwide remain in intact in undisturbed conditions. So intact structure and low pressure. And a whopping 86% of these best of the last rainforests are unprotected. And so far, as I said, conservation focus has largely been on protecting forest extent or forest cover while ignoring forest quality. So with this context and with these two new data sets, the structural condition index and the FSII, I was really keen to explore them to answer questions such as, are these really high integrity forests associated with a lower likelihood of species extinction compared with, let's say, structurally intact forests alone, and compared with forest cover, which has all of these other pressures in it? And secondly, how much remains? How much high integrity tropical forest remains for vertebrates? And how does this vary by species, threatened status, and population trends? So let's get into the first question here on extinction risk in high integrity forests compared with structurally intact forests and forest cover as a whole. So I'll talk about the methods first and then get into the results. So the data sets I used for this are the geographic range maps or species range maps, shown here as an example of the western gorilla in Africa. Broad spatial distribution of species. They are not as good as species distribution models, but they are coarse. And the thing is that you have them for all species of mammals, birds, reptiles, and amphibians, terrestrial species. So I pulled together data on geographic range map data on 16,396 species of. And using datasets on the IUCN website on habitat preferences of the species, I classified species as either rainforest obligate exclusively in tropical rainforests and are therefore highly dependent on these habitats, and rainforest associated species that occur not only in tropical rainforests but other kinds of ecosystems as well. I then resampled the condition index and the forest integrity for structural integrity indices. So the resolution initially was at 30 meters, which is a really fine resolution. But at 30 meters, it's quite challenging to computationally to work with thousands of species as I had. So I resampled them to 1 kilometer resolution. And you come up with these 18 categories of SEA values, categories of FSI values. So this 1 kilometer resolution matches the resolution of the human footprint. And prior work with the human footprint on similar kind of extinction risk modeling has shown that this kind of resolution works. So I resampled these data sets. I reclassified them into 3 classes of low structural condition and integrity, moderate structural condition integrity, and high structural condition integrity, where the dark greens are really the best quality forests. And for each species iteratively, I obtained the total area in square kilometers for each of these classes of low, moderate, and high condition and integrity forests. So as an example, I took the range of the western gorilla. I overlaid it on the structural condition index. These pixel values from 0 to 18 were classified into low, medium, and high. And then I started to extract these data. How many pixels of value 1? How many pixels of value 2? And these are all 1 into 1 kilometer pixels. Note that so degraded that we classified it as non-forest. So when you do this, you come up with this kind of data set. So here I have the area in square kilometers under various classes of SEI and FSII indices. So if you were to just look at the green bars, you would see that at the top is the percentage. You see that 66% of the range of the western gorilla is structurally intact. If you just look at structural intactness, that's a pretty good number. Everything seems good. But when you start adding in the pressures, the human pressures with the structural integrity index, that drops quite a bit to 41%. Is not only structurally intact, but under low human pressures. So these are the response variables. These are the predictive variables of my analysis. And I standardized each of these. I calculated the relative difference in each of these variables. So for example, for the structural condition index, I calculated the relative difference between high and low structural condition. So these values range from -1 to +1. So value approximately 100% of the range of the gorilla is low structural condition, whereas a value of +1 as an example, would mean that 100% of the range of the gorilla is under high structural condition. For my response variables, I used the IUCN threatened status. I pooled the three categories, critically endangered, endangered, and vulnerable as threatened, and the two categories, near threatened and least concern as not threatened, and discarded data deficient species. So after doing all this, I had 16,396 species, and I parameterized the model as I'm trying to estimate the probability that a species being threatened as a function of structural condition, structural integrity, structural condition, and forest cover. So this is a binary like response variable and continuous predictive variable. So it is a logistic regression analysis. The second like response variable I had is population trends, where I classified again from the IUCN species that are decreasing in populations as a 1, and species that are either stable or increasing as not decreasing as a 0, and discarded unknown species for a total of 12,853 species in this category. So again, similarly, I'm trying to estimate the probability that a species is going to decline as a function of the three habitat quality and forest cover like variables. So ordinarily, this would be kind of the simple model, but because I'm working with thousands of species, and these species are evolutionarily like related, they are not considered statistically independent. So you need to account for the phylogenetic dependence between species. So I found actually a strong phylogenetic signal using a measure known as Pragel's lambda, and consequently I used mammals, reptiles, and amphibians from the published datasets, and used a phylogenetic regression approach where I fit separate models for rainforest obligate and rainforest associated species for each of these, each of these two response variables. So with this kind of analysis, what were my findings? Are high integrity forests associated with lower likelihood of vertebrate species extinction, population decline, compared with intact forests, structurally intact forests, and forest cover? So let's take a look at the results for animals first. So here on the x-axis, you have the standardized odds, so standardized effect size. So and the closed circles show rainforest obligate species, whereas the open rainforest associated species. So when you compare forest integrity, it's quite clear that a high amount of high integrity forest within the range of a species is associated with significantly lower likelihood of extinction compared with forest cover, which is the red, the green versus the red, and the structural condition is somewhere in between. So the dotted line in the center is a line of no effect. Either way, on the other side is a strong statistically significant effect. I see some, so for example, obligate mammals, the odds ratio for forest cover is 1.32, whereas the odds ratio for structural integrity is 0.4, which is less than half. So the likelihood of species being threatened is less than half with greater amount of high integrity forests or the best quality forests. I see similar patterns with the population trends data, which are the squares. The filled squares again are for obligate species, and the open squares are for rainforest associated species. So overall, what we expected, we indeed these these best quality forests are indeed more likely to be associated with a lower likelihood of species being threatened and having a declining population. We also found consistent trends across all 4 taxonomic groups. So they're very clear for not only mammals, but birds, reptiles, and amphibians as well, and across both rainforest obligate and associated species. So in the next step, I wanted to move on and ask the question about, now that we have shown that these highest quality forests are really important to prevent more species from becoming threatened and declining, how much remains today? And does this remaining amount vary by species threatened status and population trends? So again, the GIS methods remain the same. I use the IUCN range maps for all these species. I overlaid them on the SCI and FSI rasters, and I calculated the area of each of these classes, and repeated them for 16,000 plus species. So how much is left? The first part of the question. So if I look at only structural condition, things seem pretty good. The dark green bars are the high structural condition. More than half of the forests across all of these groups are intact in structural condition. However, if I bring in integrity, the structural integrity condition plus pressure, that number drops dramatically to only 21% on average. So that's less than a quarter of the remaining forests for rainforest vertebrates are of high integrity. So this is work that's under review. The second part of the question was, does this remaining amount vary by species, threatened status, and population trends? So let's take a look at mammals first. So comparing the red, which is threatened, to the green, and the yellow, which is declining, to the gray, we see that species that are not, mammals that are not threatened and not declining, have significantly higher proportions of high integrity forests than mammals that are threatened or declining. And this was also mirrored in rainforest associated species. So for example, the median value here for rainforest obligate mammals is only 1% of threatened obligate mammals have of the range is covered by high integrity forests, a really small amount, whereas 30% of the forests of non-threatened obligate mammals are of high integrity. So disproportionately low amounts of high integrity forests for threatened and declining species. Again, these patterns were consistent across all 4 taxonomic groups, and all of these values are statistically significant if you can look at the significant stars. How does this amount of high integrity rainforest compare with the amount of forest cover, which is often used as a measure of habitat for biodiversity, right? So when you look at the data for cover, you see kind of, it's almost like the inverse. If you look at the violin plots here, it's almost like the inverse in terms of the data distribution, where there's clearly a lot more forest cover, which is like 77% forest cover on average across all of these taxonomic groups, compared with only 21% of high integrity forest. And unlike the previous results where everything was statistically significant, here, you would expect that species that are not threatened and not declining would actually have more forest cover also, but not really the case. Only in 6 out of 16 pairwise comparisons was that the case here. So there does not seem to be as clear an association between forest cover and species threatened status as there is with high integrity forests. So the key findings here for the first question are that forests of high integrity, that is intact condition and low pressure, are indeed associated with lower likelihood of species being threatened or declining in population. And for the next question, less than a quarter of the tropical forests remaining for terrestrial vertebrates are of high integrity, and disproportionately low amounts of high integrity rainforests are left for threatened and declining species. So what are the main conclusions we can draw from this? So that the first one would be that preserving whatever remaining high integrity forests we have would probably be key to averting additional biodiversity loss across the humid tropics, which is arguably the most biodiverse of all terrestrial ecosystems. However, that may not be the only solution. We're not saying just do that. There's an immense amount of rainforest of lower integrity, and so the targeted restoration wherever possible of these forests is really key. And many of these low integrity forests actually have significantly, they retain a lot of their biodiversity and even their ecosystem functions and services. So as opposed to converting them into agriculture, it would always be better to, wherever possible, to restore them. From a policy standpoint, there has been some good news in the sense that Target 1 of the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework that was formalized in 2022, December 2022 last year, it included high ecosystems of high integrity for the first time. And the goal, Target 1 is to achieve near zero loss of high biodiversity importance areas including ecosystems of high integrity by 2030. There are no clear benchmarks or quantitative guidelines to do so, but at least this is the first step in that they have at least acknowledged that these ecosystems might be important. So thank you very much for your time, and with that, I'm happy to take your questions.
Thank you, Rajeev. So I invite folks to put their questions in the live Q&A section, and I'll time for that. And in the meantime, I can ask you a question. The rainforest associated species that you referred to, are those species then that kind of traverse the range of kind of typical rainforest and other systems? And if so, what are those other systems that they are inhabiting?
They could be, for example, migratory birds that could be spending their breeding grounds in the Arctic, for example, and they could be wintering in tropical rainforests, right? There could be passage migrants. So we define the rainforest associated species as, so let's go back to the obligate species, which is, we defined it as the range overlap with the tropical forest biome needs to be between 80 to 100%. And in terms of its habitat preference based on the IUCN data, it needs to exclusively occur in tropical rainforests. So these were the two criteria. But for a rainforest associated species, we did not set a criteria for range overlap. And it could occur, it has to occur in rainforests for sure, but it can also occur in multiple other habitats, such as, for example, migratory birds. So this kind of, I would imagine that for a migratory bird that's wintering in rainforest habitats, the loss of rainforest could be a serious problem because their wintering grounds might be gone and potentially endangering them, right? So that's how these mechanisms might work. So even though we call them rainforest associated, they're not as dependent as rainforest obligate species, but it still could be a big problem for them, the loss of rainforest habitats.
I got it. Thanks. Yeah. And that leads to my second question. And that is if the SCI index that you mentioned, it's affected by cover and by height. And so in intact rainforest, I think we would expect there to be a full closed canopy cover. And as Jed's talk pointed out, that could be plant area index values as high as 6. And so those are very thick. But for many of these other species, including rainforest associated species, I could imagine that their preferred habitat could include shorter stature forests and or forests that naturally have less cover. And so do you think then that some of the criteria that goes into the definition of the SCI could be influencing these results? In other words, if there are some species that for some part of their annual migration or whatever it is are actually obligate in forests that have sparser cover, could that be affecting then the kind of associated conclusions about forest intactedness in terms of its ability to maintain species presence and reduce population declines?
To be honest, I don't really know. The way we have parameterized these data sets and these models is asking the simple question of how much intact forest is there, and does this intact forest influence the risk of extinction of these species? So I think for the kind of question that you're getting at, it might be more amenable to point data. For example, if you go out there and do a point count, or like what Jed showed for his camera traps and how he integrated those data sets with remote sensing data. So those might get better at like habitat selection information. So what we are doing here is more of a broad global scale structure across, all species. So each of our models is not, we are not able to infer on individual species as such, or individual groups of species, but we're able to infer more on the entire community as such, right? So at a global scale. So I think those kind of questions would be much more amenable, easier to answer with by integrating field data with remote sensing data such as this.
Okay, yeah, that's great. Because I've found in some of my own research that some species actually respond very positively to open cover and low stature. And so that was kind of the source of my question, if that could be a confounding factor that could even aggregate at your larger 1 kilometer scales across the 16,000 species. So very interesting. I think we're out of time. If there's any other questions.
I don't see any other questions in the Q&A from participants. So, but we could try to follow up with those afterwards if Rajeev is willing. But I do have Rajeev, if you don't mind. I think the presentations that both you and Jed gave are not only really good presentations, but really important, in terms of biodiversity and the status and informing policy. So I wonder, beyond, publishing in the best possible journal you can and getting this out to the community, have you thought about ways that you can interact with the policy community to sort of convey this really important information and findings that you're coming up with?
So I think it's a tough question to answer in the sense that we are working actually with like colleagues at UNDP, and the hope is that when situations arrive, such as the Global Biodiversity Framework, GBF, or other kinds of policy forums, this kind of work would get pushed into the the vision of the people who actually attend these these kind of policy forums. So it's been, I believe the GBF document was the first one where ecological integrity was introduced as a term, and it went for the first time, I think, beyond just forest cover alone. So that is a start. So hopefully, as these results come out, and we really see that there are strong effects above and beyond forest cover, people will really start to take notice and focus on protecting whatever we have right now, the best of them. It's really important to save rather than letting it degrade further.
Yeah, great. Yeah, it's nice that you have those hooks through the United Nations Development Program and these other policy-oriented conservation efforts. So, thank you again for participating. I know it's really late for you.
Thank you so much. No worries. Thank you so much for inviting me. Happy to stay on.
All right. I guess gears a little bit and move from the tropics to higher latitude ecosystems, the Arctic and boreal parts of the world, boreal forest parts of the world. And our next speaker is Rebecca Scholten, who's a PhD candidate in Amsterdam. Rebecca, I think I'll let you pronounce the name of the university, which I'll surely get wrong. But Rebecca's work is looking into the dynamic relationship between Arctic and boreal fires and climate warming. It combines field data and satellite imagery to elucidate shifts in high latitude fire patterns and places a special emphasis on extreme fire events. Prior to her PhD work, she conducted research in ecosystem disturbances and environmental challenges in temperate regions in New Zealand, and worked at the Joint Research Center in Italy. So with that, I pass it off to you, Rebecca.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks everyone for joining in, and a special thanks, of course, to Scott and Chris for inviting me. I'm very excited to show you a bit of a summary of what I've done in my PhD, which I'm currently finishing up. So I'll take you a bit away from the questions or the challenges with biodiversity and conservation and towards the realm of fire and how Arctic boreal fires are changing in a warming climate. So by now, you probably all know that fire is a natural disturbance in boreal regions. These forests tend to burn at irregular intervals, and it also helps rejuvenation. But recently, we're seeing really large burned areas in specific areas. Most recently, or the most recent example is, of course, Canada this year, where some estimates say that up to 5% of the total forested area burned in one single year. And this has really strong implications and bad implications for local populations, of course, also for people that live further downwind because of smoke impacts or air quality. But it also really affects the carbon cycle because a lot of carbon is emitted from these fires. So, and Canada is only the most recent one of a series event. Previously, we've seen 3 years or 3 consecutive years of really extreme fires in eastern Siberia. And we've also seen extreme fire events in Alaska in the last 20 years and also extreme tundra burning. So we may ask us if we see this, is this a sign of global warming? And why does it seem to be that always the same areas are being affected while others are being kind of unaffected? So is there something that really shapes the sensitivity of these regions towards climate and large fires? And if so, what is it? And what does this all mean then for the future of the boreal forest and tundra ecosystems and for the carbon stored in them? And this is what I want to discuss a little bit in the next 20 minutes. So to understand how extreme fires are or how exceptional fires are, we first have to understand the system. So how much fire and what kind of fire is normal in a specific region. And this is what we call a fire regime. A fire regime takes into account, for example, how frequently does an area burn? Does it burn every 10 years, every 100 years, every thousands, or several thousands of years? How many fires and how many ignitions do we have in these regions? And are fires ignited rather by humans or by lightning, so natural ignitions? How large are fires usually? How long do they usually burn? How intensely do they burn? So do we have low intensity surface fires or high intensity crown fires? And when do these fires burn in the season? So are they rather spring fires or summer fires or maybe even autumn fires? Once we understand the fire regime, then we can think about pathways for how this can intensify. One very straightforward way how fire regimes can intensify is by fires burning more frequently. And this can happen, for example, because fires are growing larger than usual or because there's more fires than usual. And if fires burn more frequently, then of course the ecosystem doesn't have the capacity to restore to its original pre-fire state, and this may introduce, for example, ecosystem shifts. Fires can also burn more intensely. For example, a previously surface fire regime can turn into a crown fire regime, and this is often also very much interconnected with fires burning more frequently. For example, if younger stems are burning, then the trees are closer to each other, so we have more fuels, and there is a higher likelihood for a crown fire. So in my work, I've been trying to characterize arctic-boreal pyroregions. These are regions with similar fire regime properties using satellite data. And then I want to find out if these regions that are similar in fire regime properties, if they react differently to a changing climate. So first things first, I'm using satellite data. So this is pixel-based data. And the first thing I have to do is actually to identify single fires from satellite data. This is what you can see here. So I developed a fire tracking methodology that is using satellite data to track single fires, find all the ignitions, sees how they grow together, and then we can infer fire spread, the fire duration, the final fire size, and so on. And all these properties that we get from single fires, we then aggregate these fire regime properties to a grid cell. And then these properties are, for example, the percentage burned area, which gives us information about the fire frequency as well, the ignition density, or how many fires do we have, fire size, the start date of fires, the fire duration, and the fire intensity. And these properties I throw into an unsupervised clustering, and then I come up with pyroregions. So pyroregions are then regions that are similar regarding these 6 fire regime properties. And here you can see the result of these. I use satellite data from the Vrije satellite, so that started in 2012, and I have data until 2021. I'm just going to show box plots here as well of 4 different fire regime properties to give you a bit of an indication of how these pyroregions are characterized. So first up, the ignition density tells us about whether fires are generally rather rare or rather frequent. And we can, for example, here see that this dark red pyroregion is really popping up, which is located in southern Siberia. So this is really where we have the most fires. Next up, we have fire size, so that tells us whether usually we have rather small or large fires. Here we can see the largest fires on average we see in this pink fire regime, which is situated in Western Canada and also in Eastern Canada. Then on the bottom left, we have the fire start. So this gives us information about whether fires are usually rather early in the season or late in the season. We can, for example, see that the southern Siberian fire regime burns very early in the season, whereas the others are burning more during summer. And lastly, we have fire radiative power, which gives us an indication of the intensity of fires, so how hot do they burn, as measured by the satellite. So this can give us information basically of whether we have rather cool fires or intense fires. And here we can see, for example, that the pink and the blue fire regime, which are mostly in boreal North America, show the highest intensity fires. And using these 4 different fire regime properties, we named our 7 fire regimes. And what we found are two big groups of fire regimes. One is the one that you see at the top, the green, orange, and blue one. These are all rare fires and small fires. And as you can see on the map, these are often in tundra regions, so especially the orange and the blue one are often seen in tundra regions. But it's also they are also covering Europe. And this already gives us an indication that there can be different reasons why we have little fires. So it can be climatically or because of fuel limitations, which is more likely in tundra regions. But in Europe, of course, we know that there's forests and we know that it's hot enough to burn. So most likely it's because of a high population density that we see very little fires. The other big block of pyroregions is the one that you see at the bottom, so the turquoise, yellow, and purple ones. And these are all characterized by frequent and large fires. And it's important to note that these are all the regions which are experiencing recent fire extremes. So large fires seem to be very important for fire extremes. As a next step, we can also look at why these pyroregions are appearing in certain places. So what is governing where these fire regions are occurring. And we looked at 9 different variables for this, but I'm only showing 2 because otherwise it's going to get maybe a little bit too much information. So on the left-hand side, we have the climatic summer vapor pressure deficit. So this gives us an indication of how favorable the weather is on average for fires. And on the right-hand side, we have the percentage wilderness. So this is the fraction for each pixel of each pixel that is completely uninfluenced by humans according to the human footprint map. And we can see, so for the vapor pressure deficit, there's really 2 areas that are still pyroregions that are sticking out, which are the yellow and the red one in Siberia. So Yakutia and southern Siberia seem to be climatically quite prone. And these are also regions where we see the largest ignition density, so the most fires. But the largest differences between pyroregions we see when we look at the percentage wilderness. And one thing that we observed here was that all the regions where we see large fires, or these frequent large fires, the turquoise, yellow, and purple one, they all have a very large percentage wilderness areas. Whereas regions where we have rare and small fires are often, small fires are often human dominated. And what was also interesting to see here was that we have 2 areas that are really human dominated, southern Siberia and Europe. And these behave very differently because one of them has very rare fires and one has very frequent fires. So the influence of humans can also be really opposing depending on local practices and regulations. So next we wanted to find out how we can see which of these areas are most sensitive to climate. And one way to look at that is by looking at the climatic response of fire size. And this is what you can see here. So each dot here represents one grid cell or one pixel of the map. And we have the climatic vapor pressure deficit. So how fire prone is the weather usually versus the fire size. And each dot is colored by its percentage wilderness. So the green dots are rather wild and the pink dots are rather human dominated. And we can see if we put a regression line through the wildest area, 80 to 100% wild, and the least wild areas, 0 to 20% wild, we can see very different gradients. And we can also see that fires grow a lot larger with favorable climate in wilderness regions as opposed to human dominated regions. So humans really seem to have a very attenuating effect on fire size. And we could also see this when we were looking at interannual variability, so how sensitive is climate, is fire activity to climate interannually, because then we could see that the most sensitive regions to climate were indeed regions where we had large fires and large amounts of wilderness, and tundra regions, so this orange pyro region. So what's interesting about this is, of course, that the high size climate sensitivity that we found is actually indeed in regions that show recent fire extremes. Next, I want to go through 2 case studies zooming into these regions of recent fire extremes and talk about how climate change has already led to some intensifications of fire regimes. The first case study I want to talk about is Eastern Siberia. So Eastern Siberia has seen very large burnt area in 2019, 2020, and 2021, so 3 years in a row, which is really exceptional. And we wanted to find out whether we can find some large-scale drivers for these. So we again looked at the satellite records for fire, this time from 2001 to 2021, and we selected all weeks with an extreme fire activity in this region in summer. And then we looked at weather anomalies during these extreme fire weeks or extreme fire events. And this is what you can see here. So on the left-hand side, we have the 2-meter temperature anomaly, and on the right-hand side, the 500 hectopascal geopotential anomaly. So this tells us about high and low pressure systems. So high pressure systems would be pink and low pressure systems green. And the stippled area in the map shows you where the extreme fire events are significantly different from the climatology. So maybe not surprisingly, when we have extreme fire activity in Siberia here, then we also have higher than usual temperatures, and we often have a high pressure system over Eastern Siberia. And this is, as I said, not really surprising, because high pressure systems really lead to fire-prone weather, and they can also, for example, lead to more convective energy, leading to thunderstorms and then to lightning strikes. But what we found interesting about these circumpolar plots is that if you go from the Atlantic over Europe and Western Siberia to Eastern Siberia, then you see this alternating pattern of negative anomalies, positive anomalies, negative and positive anomalies in both pictures. And this made us think that maybe there is something anomalous happening with the jet stream that is causing this blocked high pressure system that we're seeing over Eastern Siberia. So the jet stream is a band of high altitude strong winds that is blowing around the mid-latitudes in summer, and it's meandering, so it's kind of dipping northward and southward, and with that it transports warm air from the tropics into the mid-latitudes, leading to high pressure systems, and cold air from the poles also into the mid-latitudes, leading to low pressure systems, and it then transports these over the mid-latitudes. So when we looked at the jet stream in weeks of extreme fire events, this is what you can see here. So that's the total wind anomaly at 250 hectopascal, 10 to 12 kilometers height. Then we could see this very interesting pattern of higher than usual winds along the Arctic coastline, shown here in orange, and then weaker than usual winds along the mid-latitudes in purple. And the mid-latitudes, as I said, is where the jet stream is normally situated. So what we're seeing is a northward replacement of the jet stream, which is often termed an Arctic front jet because it's blowing along the Arctic. And this one often co-occurs with a relatively strong subtropical jet, so that's further south, building so-called double jets. And these double jets seem to be quite capable in trapping the meandering of the waves and thereby leading to blocking events and blocking of high pressure systems. And it seems that this jet stream configuration really very often leads to blocking events over Eastern Siberia. But when we looked at all the Arctic front jet situations over the last 20 years, we found that not all of them automatically caused extreme fire activity over Eastern Siberia. And it was only when we took snow melt into account that we got a complete picture. This is what you can see in this scatter plot. So each dot here represents 1 week. It's colored by its burn anomaly. So the darker red it is, the more anomalous is the burning. These are weeks of summer. And on the x-axis, we have the snowmelt anomaly. So on the left, we have earlier than usual snowmelt over eastern Siberia again. And on the y-axis, we have the correlation with the Arctic front jet. So basically what we're doing for this is we take the total wind anomaly of each week and we correlate it onto this pattern. And if the pattern correlation is positive, then we have more likely an Arctic front jet situation. And if it's negative, then we have more likely jet stream along the mid-latitudes. And as you can see, pretty much all of our extreme burn anomalies are happening in years with an early snowmelt and in weeks where we have an Arctic front jet. So it's really the compounding event of both that is facilitating these fire extremes. So lastly, we also wanted to know whether the drivers that we're finding are somewhat connected to a warming climate. For that, we looked at trends in these drivers over time. And this is what you can see here. So on the left-hand side, we have the trend in snowmelt for Siberia, for the region of eastern Siberia over the last 50 years. And we found that on average, snowmelt starts about a week earlier than 40 years ago. And this is actually accelerating the further north you go. So if we go to northern tundra regions, then we see twice that. So snowmelt starts about 2 weeks earlier than 1980. And this is really important, especially because 2019 and 2020 also featured an extreme amount of tundra fires. And snowmelt might be one of the major drivers behind this. And on the right-hand side, we see that the frequency of the Arctic front jet pattern has also increased in the last 40 years. So frequency here is measured as the weeks of the year that we see this Arctic front jet pattern. And what you can see here is that 1980, for example, we had maybe one Arctic front jet week every 2 years or so, whereas nowadays it's more 2 weeks per year that we see this. So it's a really strong increase. And in conclusion, this is why we think that these compounding changes that are happening due to a warming climate are really facilitating the fire extremes that we're seeing in Siberia now. Lastly, I wanted to go to another kind of extreme and give you a bit of an overview of these. So I'm talking about overwintering or zombie fires and the question whether they are on a rise in a warming climate. So overwintering fires are fires that do not extinguish at the end of a fire season. So in the back, by the way, you can see some satellite images, a time series of an overwintering reappearing. So these fires do not extinguish at the end of a fire season, but they smolder throughout winter in deep organic soils or also in tree roots. And then they flare up again in the next year and start a new forest fire. And these fires have been reported for a couple of times now in Alaska and the Northwest Territories, but also in eastern Siberia. And we wanted to find out whether they're somewhat connected to a warming climate. So in our study on Western Boreal North America, Northwest Territories and Alaska, we found that it is indeed hot summers and large fire years that are somehow favoring the occurrence or the survival of overwintering fires. Basically, if we have a high summer temperature, here shown as an orange line, then we have a higher chance of large burned area. Of course, this is not linear. This is not like the only driver, but it's one of the main climatic drivers of burned area. And if we have large burned area, then we have a higher chance of overwintering fires surviving. And the big peak you can see here was at the time of this paper, the largest fire year in the Northwest Territories, 2014. And I'm half sure that this year has probably surpassed this very extreme year. So there's of course also the question whether, or I'm relatively sure that we're going to see some of these fires also popping up next year. So since it's summer, since our time series on satellite data for fires is relatively short, it's pretty hard to say whether there's an actual increase in overwintering fires. But what we can look at is whether there are changes in these drivers again. And this is what we did in the study. So here you can see the summer temperature and for Alaska and the Northwest Territories, which show a significant increase over the last 40 years. And that also already led to an increase in burnt area in Alaska. And at the time of the study, so it ended in 2018, our time series, this increase was not significant yet for the Northwest Territories. And with that, I will come to my conclusions. So what I would like you to remember is that there's a very large variability in Arctic boreal pyroregions, and a lot of that is actually shaped by humans. And this kind of variability also represents differences in sensitivity to climate. So bioregions with large fires and bioregions where we've experienced that have experienced recent fire extremes seem to be currently most sensitive to climate. And there's also multiple lines of evidence that point to an intensification of arctic-boreal fire regimes, be it through larger fire seasons, but also through extreme phenomena such as extreme smoldering of overwintering fires. And with that, I would like to thank you all for listening, and I'm looking forward to questions.
Thank you, Rebecca. Great presentation. Really nice work you're doing. I think you're at the forefront of a lot of this. I don't see any questions in the chat. We've got a little over 30 minutes left, but I think we have time maybe for one question, which I'll ask if nobody else jumps in. I know you're dealing with these, these large scale patterns in circulation, and it's really like groundbreaking work in a lot of ways. I wonder to what extent you bring in things like ocean circulation or sea ice effects into your work.
Yeah, that's a really great question. Really good question. And I remember we were actually discussing this when we were looking at the jet stream circulation stuff, because we also know that sea ice is really affecting the jet stream. So it's one step further to kind of look at, I think currently it's not completely understood why this Arctic front jet, so this northward replacement of the jet stream, is happening. And sea ice might be a very important driver of these circulation changes. We haven't looked at that in this study though, but yeah, it's a very interesting question, I think.
Okay, we have a question now, another question. It's from Camille Gaillard. He's asking, did you characterize the vegetation cover in relation to fire intensity and frequency? And is there a relationship between plant types, canopy cover, and the frequency and intensity of fire?
Yeah, this is a very good question. So we also looked at above ground biomass and how that can kind of be a predictor of fire intensity. And we also looked at the dominant tree species. So there have been previous studies that have shown that so we do have lower intensity fires on average in Eurasia and high intensity fires in boreal North America. And that is actually due to tree species. So in boreal North America, we have more fire embraces, black spruce, which is favoring crown fires. And this is why we have high intensity there, as opposed to boreal Eurasia, where we have often large trees or pine trees that are rather fire avoiders. So this is something we also took into account, and it's something that we could also see in our pyro regions, that the tree species did really play a big role. Fuel amount in total, we didn't really see a large effect, but I think the amount of fuels are probably most important for fires in tundra regions. So in boreal forest, I wouldn't really expect to be a lot of fuel limitations. I hope that this answers your question.
Great. Thank you very much, Rebecca. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
I'll pass it to you, Chris, to introduce our last but not least speaker.
Thank you. Thank you, Rebecca. So our final speaker is Marc. And Marc, you're going to have to forgive me because I don't want to butcher your last name. So if you could remind us how to correctly pronounce that.
Do you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Macias-Fauria.
Okay. Well, you know what? I'm going to leave it at that because I'm not going to do any better. So thank you. Marc is a professor of biogeosciences at the School of Geography and the Environment at the University of Oxford. He's an ecologist with a focus on cold environments, and his research is mostly directed at understanding the coupling of physical and biological systems. To this end, he employs ecological records across a range of scales to quantitatively understand ecological and biogeographic processes as they are constrained by the physical environment. He gained a degree in biology at the University of Barcelona and an MS at the Department of Biological Sciences at the University of Calgary, and finally got his PhD in the Department of Geology at the University of Helsinki. So with that, I will hand it over to Marc. Thank you.
Thank you. I hope you can see my screen.
Looks great.
Great, good. So, well, thanks Scott and Chris for inviting me to this session. I've been enjoying it a lot in the last couple of hours. So now it's my turn. I wrote quite a long title for the session. I can read it out loud. Towards a quantitative and spatially comprehensive understanding of plant-herbivore interactions in the Arctic through remote sensing. There are many scales at which this could apply. I will focus my talk today to the landscape scale, a relatively small area, and to drones, not satellites, although we have also worked at regional and larger scale with spaceborne remote sensing. So just to give some introductory ideas before I get into the example that I will use today to illustrate this talk. I just would like to basically start introducing or probably reminding rather than introducing the detection and attribution of ecological and environmental change. So detecting environmental change, which basically implies assuming some sort of a natural variability and detecting a trend that goes beyond that natural variability, can be done in ecology at multiple scales. And we can employ a diversity of approaches to that. Plots, remote sensing, which could include repeat photography, repeated surveys across gradients or regions, and also reconstructions using proxies or meta-analyses, all can be used to detect a given trend of ecological or environmental change. Attribution is a harder beast to tame, and it implies knowing drivers of change and actually being able to link causally the driver of change with the given variable for which we have detected a given change. In ecology, normally attribution is done through experiments, and in the field, these experiments are based on plots. There is plenty of literature on how to do good plot-based experimental field-based ecology, but ideally these are well replicated and they consist of treatments and controls. And then once we do that, we can proceed to causal inference. However, if we are spatial or space aware, as we are all here, at least, we know that the position of the plots in the landscape is not very often discussed, and how this position can influence both the detection of change and the causal inference. It's even less often quantified. And yet we know that landscapes have a structure. This is a satellite picture of an area close to my heart since I did my master's there, the Canadian Rockies, east of Alberta. And it is obvious when looking at this very structured landscape that the position of a given plot will change or alter or determine a lot the direction of our detections and attributions. So how can we robustly upscale observations at the plot level to the landscape scale is a question that I and my group often ask ourselves. So of course, couldn't be otherwise. Remote sensing comes to the rescue in this aspect. So very intuitively, remote sensing helps us fill in these gaps between the plot and the landscape. Although remote sensing has been used widely, it has normally been used in detection of changes, not in at least narrowly understood attribution. However, with affordable technologies, both space and airborne, it produces data over a range of scales and resolutions, and that allows the design of studies that might be getting closer and closer to the appropriate scales of the mechanisms that we're interested in. So once I have kind of given this sort of a conceptual introduction as to the work that I will present today, I should introduce another phenomenon that probably you're all familiar with, which is the greening of the tundra. And overall, our question would be what has been, is, and will be the response of tundra vegetation to past and current environmental changes. We know that Arctic warming has been linked to increases in tundra shrub cover and growth in recent decades, and that there has been a link between this increase in productivity, in above ground productivity, and shrubs to Arctic warming and the expansion of deciduous shrubs in the tundra. This is a picture of the Yamal Peninsula, where greening, not as much, but as it happens in many other places, has been occurring and detected over the last decades. So, how has this signal been detected? It has been detected at a variety of scales. It has been detected through remote sensing, as we can see in these plots here, essentially from satellite data using greenness indices, NDVI, EVI, and such indices. There is a clear decadal increase both for the whole of the tundra and for North America and Eurasia in above ground, in these vegetation indices, which have been correlated on the ground with above ground biomass for the tundra. But at the plot scale, we also have plenty of information, which basically indicates that mosses and lichens are declining and shrubs are increasing as environmental change and global warming increases in the Arctic. So I just want to show this paper here, led by Logan Berner at the Northern Arizona University, in which the change is detected and correlations are found between the greening and a series of covariates. A statistical model was used to assess the relative contribution of these drivers, potential drivers, and summer warmth index and annual soil temperature were selected as the most as the variables with most success in explaining the variance in the greening. As stark as these relationships are, this is not per se an attribution study, at least in the way that ecologists could accept it to be an attribution study. So what if we go to the ground and look at the traditional plot level experiments? So in the Arctic, classic ecological field experiments are normally using open top chambers, as you can see in this picture here for northern Canada, which simulate, and that would be the experiment, warming, passive warming inside the chambers, and create controls which have no passive warming outside of them, and detect the relative changes in the treatment and the controls, and can actually, assuming that they control for many other variables, end up with causal mechanisms or causal inference. There is also similar plot level work done with snow fences, which focuses on the study of or on manipulating snow depth. And there is a very rich tradition of exclosures to assess the impact of herbivory. This particular review paper here shows the many exclosure experiment that has been going on in the tundra for the last decades. Why do we focus so much on herbivory, and how big is this element in basically modulating or explaining the recent trends in Arctic biomass? So essentially, the role of herbivory has been hypothesized as a trigger of ecosystem change in the Arctic. At its most, basically, at its strongest effects, large herbivores have been hypothesized to change the state of Arctic terrestrial systems by opening them up and enabling transitions from lichen and grassland-dominated ecosystems to graminoid-dominated ecosystems. They also have been known to prevent shrub encroachment, to open up the tundra, and to basically deliver all sorts of ecosystem function consequences through their action. There is evidence from observations from all this, which I place here. And I just wanted to highlight here that the hypothesized effect of herbivore effects on the tundra increases with density of herbivores, but also is poised to increase with herbivore diversity. So how important is herbivory in basically affecting the overall biomass accumulation in the tundra as a response to warmer temperatures? So I'm gonna show in the next slides an example of unpublished work that has been led by a former PhD student of mine, Marcus Spiegel, in the Yamal Peninsula in northwesternmost Siberia, highlighted here in this map to the bottom left. And in here, as I said, we are focusing at the landscape scale. I found that focusing at the landscape scale was probably the closest approach that we could have to an attribution study where we use remote sensing and we are especially explicit and especially comprehensive. So in this case, what do we have? We have an experiment, and the experiment consists on agreeing with neighboring reindeer herders on the place where a herd of 1,000 reindeer will visit a given area in the tundra. And so that we have an experiment that consists of a before and after visit of 1,000 reindeer herd. Our observations here are essentially done through drone imagery, but we also have radio-colored reindeer, and we have a vegetation survey that enables us to map the area where these reindeers are going to visit. Our resolution is a few centimeters, the spatial resolution, and we are aiming in here to detect the ecological processes of basically the reindeer trampling, stomping, and munching away vegetation. And we did this over a few weeks within a growing season. We used our drone imagery in a photogrammetry-based approach of this before and after vegetation change as a function of reindeer presence. And so I'm going to show you how this looks like. So in this slide here, on this satellite picture, which has dots of different colors in the left, you can see the radio-colored reindeer location as it moves from east to west or from southeast to northwest throughout the area. And in the middle of this area, you can see the landscape scale 2 hectare plot that we, well, I shouldn't say plot probably, since I have been talking about plots as much smaller units, but our study site, which you can see zoomed in this central drone image. And the vegetation survey and the landscape classification that we did resulted in essentially having a ridge top. There is you can see on the bottom the EM of the area. There is a ridge top, then there is a slope, which is dominated, as you can see, by this texture coming from the photogrammetry, dominated by tall shrubs, and then you have permafrost wetland and mesic tundra at the bottom, at the topographical bottom of this region. So we have these two things. On the one hand, we have the photogrammetry allowing us to detect vegetation volume and the reindeer moving across the landscape with radio colors. So I'm going to focus on the results now, and the results are always on the left. We have the change after the herbivory event. So before the herbivory event and after the 1,000 reindeer have moved across the landscape, and on the right we have the change 1 month later. So a month later we did the same flights, and we wanted to see what had happened a month after the let's say this herbivory pulse. So we have centimeter resolution changes, and importantly, these changes we have been able to compute the significant changes only. When you compare this data, the before and the after, it would be tempting to just subtract the biomass from one let's say t+1 to t0. but there might be a lot of noise that comes from the uncertainty of the resulting vegetation biomass volume that has been modeled from the photogrammetry, from the thousands of overlapping pictures at different camera angles that we produced. So we were able to use the limit of detection, which is essentially a significance of change that's computed at the pixel scale, depending on the precision of this photogrammetry workflow. And what we see is that just after the reindeer herbivory event, we are able to detect quite a large area which had a reduced biomass net change, especially in the meadow slope, which was on the upper part of the area, and on the erect shrub slope. There was also changes in the lower part of the permafrost area. And a month later, what we see is generalized growth or generalized increase in volume in vegetation across most of these land cover types. Just bear in mind that these reindeer visited the site during the growing season. So we are seeing a net vegetation biomass loss during the growing season after, or just after this reindeer herbivory event. We can also map this. Of course, we are using remote sensing, so we want to know not only the net effects over the whole of the landscape, but where these effects are happening. And we produce these maps. Again, the left map is the effect after the event, and the right map is the effect or the change, the observed change 1 month after the event. I have selected these 4 squares, which I will zoom in the next slide, so I think that they are going to be more explanatory. Just in here, I would like to point to a couple of things. One is that the square number 1 up here is mostly on the upper part of this slope, on the areas dominated by erect shrubs, but also on a place where there were where there was frequent visits by reindeer. The number 2 down here is a similar place that was not as much visited by reindeer, and the number 3 would be a lowland area. Just to show how precise, or how precise and accurate these signals are. In here on the right-hand side, I don't know if you can see my cursor, but you can see this blue arrow pointing to vehicle tracks. Vehicles traverse the area after the reindeer grazing event, and before we flew again 3 weeks after the event. And actually, we can detect those in the lowlands as losses in vegetation height. So the precision here and the accuracy of the signal is pretty high. So just to go into these zoomed in signals, if we look at the slope with high reindeer activity, we could call this the experiment. You can see if we focus on the change after the herbivory event, that there is widespread loss of biomass. These orange to red signals are net loss in vegetation height. The largest decreases occurred on the erect shrubs, which you can see here in this kind of white canopy tops, which are the tallest elements in the canopy. But there was quite an extensive smaller decreases in low-lying vegetation around the area. If we go to the slope with low reindeer activity, this control, you can also see these tops of erect high shrubs, but you can see that there is virtually no signal before and after the event. And then if we go into the lowlands, you can see that there was generalized loss of low-lying vegetation height. 1 month later, interestingly, what we see is quite a lot of growth in the low-lying vegetation between the erect shrubs, as you can see in the upper panel here. And also, we see a generalized growth in wet topographic lows, which is not necessarily linked or linkable with the reindeer visitation. But up to now, we've only used the reindeer data in a very indirect way. How can we actually nail it, let's say, and use the radiocolor data to basically demonstrate that the loss of biomass that we have been able to detect is linked to the reindeer visitation. So in here, what we do is we have computed this integrated proximity to reindeer. And note that this integrated